Okay, I think it's 6:30 here, and we can. I think we can start, right?
Sounds great.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Great. Thank you all for coming. And today we are continuing our lecture series, and our guest is Dr. Jonathan Gregg. Jonathan Gregg is a senior postdoctoral fellow at KU Leuven. He's currently in Chicago, but he's a senior postdoctoral fellow over here in Europe. He recently published a book, The First Principle in Late Neoplatonism, and today he's going to talk about reason, revelation, and epistemic authority in Byzantium. Jonathan, the Zoom is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Liliana. Yeah, thank you everyone for joining. So this is basically kind of picking up off of an article I published a couple years ago on the use of skeptical arguments and the adjudication between reason and revelation as criteria for epistemic certainty. It's from the journal Theory, which actually came out last year, even though it was 2 years ago. It was published online, but this is basically an expansion on that. So I apologize in advance. This gets into some weeds historically, but basically try to kind of wrap it up with sort of discussion on just the very issue of epistemic authority between reason and revelation. So let me begin. In the last few years, for a variety of reasons, we are all, I'm very sure, very familiar with the topics of social epistemology, the criterion or criteria of certainty, epistemic authority, and the notion of superstition, which have generated much interest. And within the basic questions these issues raise for us in our current contemporary context, the greater question is how earlier ages thought through these issues, specifically how they would answer these issues in their own context and time, and also in turn how we can be better informed to think about these issues for ourselves. So with this preface in mind, I'd like to talk about epistemic authority in the Byzantine intellectual tradition in the context of the relation between reason and revelation. One interesting thing about the majority of Byzantines, at least the ones we'll consider today, is that they all consider Christian revelation and the knowledge that can be given by it as the foundation for any possible knowledge of things. Knowledge obtained by reason, by contrast, takes second place. The content or the kind of content it grasps can be more or less close to the kind of truth and certainty possessed by divine revelation. I say it's noteworthy because, by contrast, if we look at medieval Islamic Arabic philosophy, we find certain authors like Al-Farabi, Averroes, and so on, who maintain that divine revelation is like the Wittgensteinian ladder that leads up to the intelligible truths, which reason, when exercised well in philosophy, gives us direct access to. Revelation, by contrast, leads us to the imaginative level, to the level of reason, which is superior and grasps truths with greater certainty. This idea of the autonomy of reason over revelation is almost entirely absent among our Byzantine authors, although, as we will see, some authors come somewhat close to this by maintaining at least the equality of reason and revelation, if not the superiority of revelation. So this leads to a second factor. The criteria by which an authority is decided upon as providing the criterion of epistemic certainty. A quick example of this, which I will elaborate in the talk, is Michael Psellos' selecting of pagan Neoplatonist Proclus as the closest approximation to a Christian philosophical position, by virtue of Proclus accepting positions by reason, which approximate closest with truths manifest in revelation. By contrast, for Nicholas of Methone, almost a century later, it is the writings attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite, the follower of St. Paul rather than Proclus, which are rather to be trusted over Proclus, since Dionysius was directly inspired by God. Only such authorities which are explicitly recognized as divinely directly inspired, provides the criterion for certainty for adjudicating truths. So in my talk, I'd like to look at these two poles, namely between what I've termed position A, reason as providing partial or complete access to truths guaranteed by revelation, and B, reason as providing either fallible or simply no access to truths in and of itself, but reason providing the only criterion for certain truth. And to clarify, I don't mean in this latter case position B, that there's no use of reason in any sense, but rather that reason can only be used to articulate truths from premises given to it by revelation alone, not, in other words, from sources like the senses or reason, or especially the testimony of pagan authors outside revelation. That should have been actually from the second slide, basically. But so in this case here, for the rest of my talk, now with this slide, I would like to trace four pairs of thinkers that show indications of leaning towards position A or B, respectively. In particular, Clement of Alexandria, representing position A, and Gregory Nazianzen, as representing position B, as laying the groundwork in the 2nd to the 4th centuries AD, and then the later Byzantines, Michael Psellos and Nicholas of Methone in the 11th and 12th centuries AD, and Barlaam the Calabrian and Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, and finally Gemistos, Plethon, and Gennadios Scholarios in the 15th century. Although we see different permutations of this opposite pairing between A and B, one can see a striking consistency in the same basic issue across both different periods and controversies, especially where deciding upon one or another authority for certainty is dependent upon how one decides between A or B within the context of the Byzantine tradition. So to start with our first pair, Clement of Alexandria from around the middle, late 2nd century, and Gregory Nazianzen a couple centuries later, they provide a case study for the relation of reason and revelation for the early Christians and give us a model on which we can see our later Byzantine pairs. Clement succinctly provides us his position in the first book of his Stromates, in the English it's Miscellanies, when he asserts that truth is one, while the plurality of different philosophical sects only attain a portion of the truth. Though Clement refers to Greek or otherwise in the passage, he would include those like Epicureans, Stoics, Platonists, and so on. Clement's language in the second passage in the slide is quite striking in using the physical imagery of the Menaids, the female followers of the god Dionysus, ripping apart the limbs and body parts of King Pentheus. Although one may initially feel reassured that the philosophical sects get something right about reality, Clement's claim in this context almost implies the opposite. It's a kind of tragic, if not willful, taking apart of one whole body of truth. In the background, of course, is Clement's main points. The one logos as the manifestation of God has made clear and apparent the truth of all things, while the many philosophical schools have taken parts of the one logos and claimed the part that each has as the whole. One of the consequences of Clement's position is that there is a kind of skepticism lurking in his assessment of the philosophical schools. How can one truly know that one part is a part of a whole? What is the criterion by which one can see the different parts that are together as part of one whole? For Clement, it is the revealed logos of Christian revelation that makes this clear, while the parts of the different schools that are true as fitting the whole truth communicated by the logos is what true philosophy is, which we can see in the first passage with Clement's definition of philosophy. This so-called eclectic interpretation, from the Greek eklektikon, which means literally selective or picking out in speech, one finds inserts in Middle Platonists, as well as the so-called eclectic school in antiquity. Clement cleverly reappropriates this imagery within a Christian revealed context. Grasping the whole thus necessitates the revelation of the logos, which goes beyond mere reason alone, as each philosophical school does by itself. In sum, we can see Clement partially maintaining a partial understanding of truth for reason. So reason can give us a portion of the logos, again recalling the visceral imagery of the delimbed Pentheus, but it can only be confirmed by the revelation of the divine person to the logos itself, which is the whole body together. If we look at the second of our pair, Gregory Nazianzen presents us somewhat of a stark contrast to Clement. In his Oration 28, Gregory sets out the nature of theology concerning God, or the logos, as for Clement. Theology must inevitably lead one to apophaticism in any discourse, mirroring the nature of God who transcends all finite distinctions and is purely infinite. Gregory's initial claim, which we can see in the first couple passages, is that any attempt to grasp God by reason is bound to fail. Not only is the account concerning God, which in the Greek is ho peritheo logos, difficult to grasp, especially insofar as the subject God is infinite, in Gregory's words from Oration 38, like an undefined, unlimited ocean of being. But reason in itself is unable to grasp the true causes of things. Gregory's pronouncements in the first passage particularly is striking. He claims that even with the activity of reasoning, we still carry the senses with us, which by their nature are variable and lead astray, in his words. At the end, he makes the proclamation that our intellect cannot receive impressions by direct, certain apprehension in the Greek catalepsis. Gregory's use of the term catalepsis is striking. One sees it in the Stoics to indicate the soul's certain and complete grasp of an object communicated to it through the impression made from the external object. The Pyrrhonian skeptics like Sextus and Pyrrhicus also employ the term against the Stoics in their claim of certain knowledge. And it is this negative context with the skeptical denial of catalepsis that Gregory is implicitly referring to. Not only do we see Gregory following the skeptical strategy in denying that our intellect can have a catalepsis of objects, but later in the second passage, he will also assert that for every argument about God, there are counter-arguments in the Greek ontolepsis that one can pose. Gregory's assertion of ontolepsis again harkens back to the skeptics like Sextus, who maintain that for all arguments on any given claim, one can assert an equal number of arguments to the contrary. In these cases, there can be no positive or negative claims or judgments about a thing, but instead a suspension of judgment. In this case for Gregory, thus, the accounts or reason concerning God, opere theologos, logos, must also involve an inherent indeterminacy, at least when trying to give an account by reason. One cannot make a positive or even negative claims about God on the level of reason. Instead, as we see in the third paragraph, Gregory argues that it must be revelation, assented to through faith, in the Greek pistis, which guides and provides certainty in a way that reason cannot, which is earthbound and terrestrial in his terms, and implies otherwise that one is ignorant of your very ignorance, of one's own very ignorance. Here again, we may draw a loose parallel to the Pyrrhonian skeptics. For them, the goal of reasoning is to make one realize one's ignorance, and hence, rather than attempt to solve the impasse by reason, to suspend reason or judgment. Gregory would agree with the skeptics in an analogous sense. For the enlightened Christian, the realization of reason's ignorance should lead one to live in accordance with faith. But unlike the skeptics, faith, nevertheless, provides a positive means of knowledge as a sure guide to truth, where the Pyrrhonian would deny any such guide or criterion which involves judgment. If we compare Gregory and Clement, we can at least see a commonality for both. Knowing the whole, complete truth of things can only be attained through revelation, unattainable by reason alone. In this sense, both entertain a kind of skepticism about the possibility of comprehensive knowledge by reason in its domains, although, however, in different directions, and which I here indicate with mild skepticism as a cult with Clement, in contrast to a kind of strict skepticism with Gregory Nazianzen. So for Clement, reason is inherently capable of grasping truths by its own means, yet only so in a partial sense. By contrast, for Gregory, reason is incapable by its own resources apart from revelation. Gregory, in this respect, comes very close to the Pyrrhonian skeptical position, except only for reason apart from faith, as we have just seen. As we will see for our remaining pairs 2 to 4, that is between Psellos and Nicholas Methone, Barlaam and Gregory Palamas, and Plethon and Scholarios, we will see a similar pairing in analogous ways to these two positions, effectively between the Carmenist position, between reason and revelation, but what we refer to as position A, and a kind of anti-harmonist, or at least strongly qualified harmonist position with position B. So now turning to our next pair, 2 of Michael Psellos and Nicholas Methone. The issue over which we see both figures spar is the so-called Proclus Renaissance of this period. That is, Proclus, among other pagan Neoplatonists, who became a popular topic of interest both philosophically and theologically. Although there was never a loss of Proclus's text in Byzantium in the way there was for the Latins, along with other Greek philosophers, it seems that Psellos ignited a fresh interest in Proclus in the 11th century, which passed over into the 12th century with Nicholas Methone and later. For Michael Psellos, as we see in the first passage, Proclus represents the pinnacle of human philosophy, together with other Platonists like Plotinus, Iamblichus, and Porphyry. Psellos sees the ascent that they all describe, especially Proclus's, from the level of bodies to mathematics and then intelligibles, in his words, free of relation to bodies, as something true and ultimately in concord with the Christian faith. Despite what certain scholars have attempted to assert with Psellos, as a kind of crypto-pagan subversively using a Christian guise for his real affiliations, it seems that we should take Psellos seriously when he draws comparisons with Christian beliefs, which indeed we can see in the second paragraph, second passage, for instance, in the general comments on pagan philosophical doctrines, when Psellos takes the doctrine of the Trinity for granted, while he grants the difference in pagan philosophical views. At the same time, in his words, among the wise Greeks, reason, logos, is a highly productive component of their theological proofs, and it also contributes no small part to our own discourse as regards the union and distinction of the Son in relation to the Father, of course, referring to the three persons of the Trinity, the Christian Trinity. Psellos here recognizes the usefulness of pagan philosophical doctrines to articulate the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, which, as he asserts at the beginning, does not essentially depend on the Greeks' own philosophical doctrines, but is nonetheless an instrumental help. Parenthetically, it's also worth noting Psellos' use in the passage of the term for ourselves, kathimas in the Greek, to distinguish his own camp, that is the Christian camp, or as he will call it, Christian philosophy, elsewhere in his works, from other non-Christian philosophical schools. Psellos often elsewhere in his text demarcates between positions that are kathimas, for ourselves, and those that belong to these other identifiable non-Christian views, even if there is a crossover in doctrinal descriptions or positions. In this, Psellos sees his project as attempting to articulate a unified Christian philosophy, the term he often uses almost as a kind of hat tip to Etienne Gilson's own attempt at articulating a concept of Christian philosophy some 900 years later. What is interesting in Psellos' case is that he sees his own self-professed Christian philosophy both as borrowing much of its articulation from pagan sources, yet insofar as it draws on revelation, making clear revealed truth. It stands apart from the other pagan philosophical schools and cannot be merely reduced to the reasoning, the logos, of the so-called Greeks. In this sense, we can see Psellos' view with the selective engagement with pagan texts in a passage from his letter to Xiphilinos, a fellow monk and friend of Psellos' who became Patriarch of Constantinople and who critiqued the idea of reason and the idea of engaging with pagan sources for knowledge. For Xiphilinos, instead, a life of contemplation in the holy monasteries to be preferred to pagan reasoning and learning. Psellos bristles at this idea, as we get a hint from this passage, when he argues that reasoning, in the Greek it's syllogistai, so that could also mean syllogizing, but reasoning, my dear brother, is neither a dogma foreign to the church nor a paradoxical position of the philosophers, but rather it is only an instrument of the truth for the discovery of any sought-after thing. Psellos' argument is that reasoning is a tool for those who are not yet at the higher spiritual level that monks like Xiphilinos are at. Strikingly, Psellos refers to reasoning, or literally syllogizing, as the metaphorical milk for the Corinthians who are unable to eat the solid food of higher wisdom from the Apostle Paul's first epistle to the Corinthians. I'm sure that probably few of you have imagined Paul meaning syllogisms with milk, but that aside. So this would fit with Psellos' view that reason becomes a means to ascend to this higher spiritual levels that those like monks and holy men are already at in the Christian spiritual life. In this sense, we see an optimistic view of reasoning in conjunction with revelation, similar to Clement of Alexandria's view of the philosophical schools, approximating, albeit partially, with the whole revealed truth of revelation. Psellos' position, turning to the second of our pair, contrasts sharply with that of Nicholas of Methone, some 70 years later in the mid to late 12th century. Nicholas, as Bishop of Methone, is known for a number of theological treatises against the Latins, particularly on the dogma of the procession of the Holy Spirit, the so-called filioque controversy, and his more well-known commentary on the Neoplatonist Proclus and his 5th century treatise, The Elements of Theology. Nicholas himself employs Aristotelian logic in his critique of the Latins, and we see some recurrences of this in his Proclus commentary. Noteworthily, the commentary on the Elements is a polemic against Proclus's work, which he sees as a threat to revealed Christian truth. Insofar as Proclus argues for non-Christian positions like the pre-existence of the soul, the plurality of God's necessary causes of the cosmos, and so on. Nicholas's commentary is hence a proposition by proposition critique, showing how Proclus's theses are either incorrect or internally self-contradictory, or if they have anything right in them, it is because they are stolen from the writings attributed to the divinely inspired Dionysius the Areopagite, the follower of the Apostle Paul. Here, as modern scholars have also acknowledged, Nicholas recognizes the parallels between Proclus and the Pseudo-Dionysian corpus, although for Nicholas, insofar as he believes they are writings of the authentic Dionysius, Proclus must have depended, therefore, on Dionysius, whether in copying the correct views of Dionysius or twisting Dionysius's words, for instance, to support pagan polytheism. Although Nicholas sees Proclus as a fraudulent, the more predominant problem for Proclus or Nicholas is that Proclus sums up the heights of human reason and thus the error of reason apart from divine revelation. This comes out especially in our first passage, where Nicholas recognizes Proclus as summing up in his words every Hellenic teaching into an axiomatic structure of propositions similar in style to the ancient geometry, Euclid's own elements. In this respect, Nicholas, like Psellos, recognizes Proclus as one of the best exponents of reason. However, for Nicholas, unlike Psellos, Proclus represented more of a worthy opponent as an example of the errors of human reasoning apart from revelation. Although Nicholas's explicit target is Proclus, more immediately the threat Nicholas faces, as we can see hinted in the second passage, is from contemporaries of his who are engaged in unnamed heresies and use Proclus to defend these views. Who these specific people are has been a thorny issue in scholarship, of which there has been no consensus. However, Psellos' harmonizing strategy, almost a century earlier, certainly seems to be in the background with these heretically inclined Christians that Nicholas is addressing. Nicholas's juxtaposed language here is striking. He describes the knowledge granted to Christians implicitly by revelation as things possessing clarity, simplicity, and uncontrived quality, while knowledge from outside or pagan learning is variegated, enigmatic, and of an elegant quality. In other words, it has a sophisticated element, but in contrast to knowledge from revelation, it has a variegated, complex quality. It's not simple. So, drawing the juxtaposition. This harkens back to the notion of direct apprehension, catalepsies, involving simple, clear things, referenced in both Clement and Gregory of Nazianzen, which Clement grants to true philosophy, but Gregory denies to things grasped by reason alone. Similarly, Nicholas denies that the reasoning, at least that we see in Proclus, has such a clear, uncontrived quality, although we see glimpses of the idea that reasoning in itself, without revelation, is also prone to this variegated, uncertain element. This comes out in our next passage here. Yeah, this comes out especially in our next passage here. When Nicholas qualifies the undertaking of the arguments he will give as not coming from worldly wisdom, derived from human teaching, nor from his own wisdom, but based on faith in the revealed word, or logos. The way Nicholas qualifies the knowledge he apprehends from this worldly wisdom, or his own knowledge, implicitly from reason, suggests the inherent fallibility of such knowledge derived from reason. This gets borne out later in Nicholas's commentary, when, for instance, he depends on Dionysius as divinely inspired, implying that Dionysius is to be trusted as an authority besides revelation and propositions held by faith, insofar as Dionysius was the follower of Paul, and hence divinely inspired, providing a level of certainty that reasoning from non-inspired sources like Proclus does not. If we compare Psellos and Nicholas here, although they have sharply differing attitudes about Proclus and himself, the similarities equally stand out. Both authors, as we've seen, emphasize revelation as the ground for any certainty we can possess. How reason is understood shows some difference. For instance, as we noted earlier, Psellos comes close to Clement of Alexandria's view that reason can partially grasp truths manifested in revelation. In other words, there is an inherent ability of reason to grasp something, although only in conjunction with truths manifested in revelation. In this respect, Proclus and other so-called Greeks are instrumental for the Christian in the ascent to divine knowledge and better understanding revelation. But by contrast, Nicholas appears to follow Gregory Nazianzen's footsteps in denying that reason is able to grasp truths even in a partial way without revelation. Consequently, for Nicholas, Proclus cannot be trusted even with revelation. If Proclus is right, it is because he steals or accidentally repeats something correct from that a divinely inspired authority, most often the Pseudo-Dionysius, already claims or argues. The juxtaposition is striking when compared to Psellos. Proclus can be an authority for truth, but only when juxtaposed with revelation. But for Nicholas, Proclus is no authority except accidentally in relation to revelation or divinely inspired sources like Dionysius. So that's our pair 2. And now for pair 3, jumping a couple centuries later. we turn to Barlaam of Calabria and Gregory Palamas in the 14th century. Those familiar with Eastern Orthodox theology will, of course, recognize the pair, needless to say. Palamas is mostly known in the theological world for positing a distinction in God between what has been termed God's essence, ousia, and God's activities, in Greek energeia, where by this distinction, Palamas can affirm the possibility for direct participation in God through the activities, while God equally remains transcendent and unparticipated in virtue of his essence. Palamas argues for the distinction in defense of the so-called hesychas, a movement of monks who maintain that the direct perception and knowledge of God in this life is possible, even if God is beyond being and transcendence, and hence that the use of bodily senses in movement and prayer is essential for that participation in God. More immediately, the origins of Palamas's position comes up in an early dispute he had with Barlaam the Calabrian early in the 14th century. Palamas first encountered Barlaam in the latter's anti-Latin defense of the Greek Orthodox position that the Holy Spirit, as the third divine person of the Trinity, proceeds from the Father alone, which stands in contrast to the filioque position, where the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Barlaam's defense of the Greek position involved the claim that demonstrative arguments, that is, arguments that begin with self-evident principles, cannot be applied to God or divine matters, since God, properly speaking, transcends all things, while the principles of demonstrations can only be formulated from principles grasped by the intellect. Hence, for Barlaam, only dialectical arguments involving shared principles, that is, from Holy Scriptures, which both Latins and Greeks could hold, could be valid in the case of God, if God transcends being and thus the grasp of the human intellect. It is this early context that defines the issue of epistemic authority for Barlaam and Palamas between reason and revelation. One of the main problems for Palamas is Barlaam's denial of demonstrative knowledge about God. For Palamas, the premises derived from revelation do, in fact, provide certainty through faith, pistis, such that demonstrative knowledge about God is possible and should, in fact, be maintained. It is the starting point for Palamas that shows the contrast with Barlaam on conceiving God. Although Palamas doesn't yet articulate the essence-activities distinction in God, at least at this point in the controversy, he is willing to grant that there are divine attributes graspable by the intellect, whether by faith or in divine direct participation with God, as the hesychas would maintain, which do not threaten God's transcendence. By contrast, for Barlaam, God is transcendent in a strict sense, such that any divine attributes can only be grasped as dialectical premises, merely as disposited. At the same time, Barlaam's stance is paradoxical. Although God is absolutely transcendent, in other texts, Barlaam grants that knowledge about God can be had by both pagan philosophers working through reason and by divinely inspired Christians and theologians. We see this in our first passage on the slide, when Barlaam asserts that the same object, the same skopos in Greek, is aimed at by both divinely inspired theologians and pagan philosophers, which he specifies as the discovery of truth. For one is the truth through all things, given in principle to the apostles in an unmediated way, and discovered by us through diligence. After this, Barlaam states that the philosophical sciences introduced independently the same divinely inspired truth that has been given to the apostles by God. In other words, true philosophy outside revelation can equally lead one to the ultimate truth, both about God and the principles of beings, just as much as revelation can. Although one initially may think this contradicts Barlaam's claim that there can be no demonstrative knowledge about God, one can detect some consistency between these two stances. Although we don't find the explicit praise, let alone critique of Proclus that we find in Psellos, Barlaam references various Platonists, both Proclus and Syrianus among others, in support of his general view of a general sentence from the physical sensible world to the intelligible world, and then finally to God as transcending all being, and thus all positive, intelligible knowledge. This is roughly in keeping with the general Neoplatonist picture of the levels of reality, particularly between soul as mediating the sensible and intelligible worlds, intellect with the forms of beings, and the one as the first cause transcending all being. Effectively, Barlaam sees God in the same terms as the Neoplatonic one, which is both beyond being and positive knowledge, and yet is also the object aimed at in all discourse. Although it is not clear that Neoplatonists would accept Barlaam's claim that the first cause or God or divine attributes cannot be the subject of demonstrative arguments, they would agree at least with Barlaam's epistemology, much of which, as he presents it, would concord with Christian theology, or at least that part of the tradition which emphasizes God's transcendence. In turn, this would follow the line of thoughts in our second passage on the slide, where Barlaam claims that the divine part, implicitly the intellect, when united with the body, fills the intellect with folly, ignorance, false opinions, forgetfulness, and error. Implicitly detaching from the senses is the only way by which the intellect can attain truth in its ultimate object, God. Hence, for Barlaam, in a similar way to Plotinus' and other Neoplatonist description of the ascent to the One, the soul can only unify with God by detaching from the senses and then further from intellectual knowledge in a state of complete atmosia, that is, as beyond or without knowledge. Hence, the problem with the Hesychs' claim for Barlaam is that their emphasis on the senses and union with God blocks that ascent, since they stay at the level of ignorance belonging to the senses. Barlaam's epistemology is revealing if we put this in perspective with this claim of one truth for both divinely inspired theologians and the philosophers, insofar as the path of ascent is strikingly the same for both. The Christian and pagan Neoplatonists can only ascend to God by this intellectual process that leads to total unknowing. We could see some connection here to Psellos, for instance, who maintains the usefulness of reason to ascend to God, but at the same time, there's a stark contrast. Psellos still maintains the superiority of revelation or Christian philosophy over the other pagan philosophical schools, similarly to Clement of Alexandria, as we saw earlier. In fact, Barlaam's apparent emphasis on the equal footing of revelation and reason is something more radical than what we see in Psellos or Clement, and something we will see again eventually with Gemistos Plethon. For the second of our pair, Gregory Palamas, ends up strongly dissenting from Barlaam's claim of equality between knowledge received by revelation and philosophy, although in a way that doesn't entirely depart from Barlaam's basic point. Looking at our first passage, Palamas distinguishes between what belongs to nature, which is physikon in the Greek, and what belongs to the spiritual, pneumatikon. Palamas assigns pagan wisdom, which has been well excised, to the natural order, implicitly referring to reason and what it can perceive in its own nature or right. By implication, knowledge, that is revelation, imparted through faith, then belongs to the spiritual order. On the one hand, this is not far off from Barlaam's claim that knowledge obtained by revelation aims at the same objects, scopos, as knowledge from reason or philosophy. Palamas seems to concur with this initial idea. While Palamas' two orders of nature and the spiritual parallel Barlaam's own schema, Palamas makes the natural subordinate to the spiritual, which he calls gift of God, doron theou in the Greek, in a principal sense, kyrios, while what belongs to the natural is not. It can only be derivatively a gift of God. In other words, Palamas emphasizes the epistemic priority of knowledge from faith, which is given by God immediately to the intellect, over that of knowledge from reason or philosophy, which doesn't merit the same level of certainty or immediacy as the act as that of faith. Consequently, such knowledge from reason may still reach the truth, but can only be held with the same certainty and immediate access that knowledge from faith can. It cannot be held with the same certainty. So Palamas here uses the metaphor of a snake to describe the pagan wisdom obtained from human reasoning. Untamed and by itself, the snake is poisonous and dangerous, but its venom contains, in its words, no better and more useful medicine. To be used, the head and the tail of the snake must be cut off, which Palamas relates to the false teachings, such as that of polytheism and other doctrines, before the snake's mid parts with the venom can be extracted and used as an antidote against falsehoods. The snake metaphor can imply negative imagery in itself, but on the other hand, Palamas' acknowledgement that the venom contains the most effective medicine also implies the inverse. The snake, in virtue of the venom, can be immensely useful as a secondary way to the truth. Still, Palamas' broader context is clear. One cannot treat pagan wisdom and human reasoning alone in this sense in the same way as knowledge obtained by faith and grace. This especially comes out in the second passage when Palamas argues that knowledge obtained from pagan learning involves care and exercise in the Greek melite, which again shows how it relates to the natural order, which is common to all men, in a way not found with grace, which is given immediately to specific individuals. This in turn implies that things given by nature imply variability. That is, they can be used well or badly, whereas things given by grace directly by God imply a determination and fixedness not found in nature. Putting Palamas in perspective, on the one hand, he would agree with Michael Psellos and Clement of Alexandria insofar as they concede the possibility of natural reason to obtain the truth, although in a partial sense for Clement and only in approximation to divine revelation for both Clement and Psellos. Although Palamas deprioritizes pagan wisdom, coming close to Nicholas Methone in this regard. He strikingly does not do away with or delegitimize it in the way that Nicholas does, but he does make it subordinate to truth granted by grace. The contrast sticks out with Barlaam here when he asserts the equality of reason and revelation to aim at its object, at least conceding that reason through pagan learning can acquire the truth, but going beyond Clement and Gregory's qualification of reason of revelation as the guarantor of truth. And now turning to our last pair, Gemistos, Plethon, and Gregorios Scholarios, 1 more century later, we find some recurrences in our third pair, Barlaam and Palamas, more so between Barlaam and Plethon specifically, as we will see. Plethon and Scholarios were involved in his disputes over whether Plato or Aristotle was a better philosopher, and more explicitly, at least for Scholarios, which philosopher was the closer to a revealed Christian account of reality. Over time, however, Scholarios and other Byzantines ended up accusing Plethon of actively endorsing paganism, especially thanks to his text, the Book of Laws, which refers to various pagan gods as principles of reality, with Zeus established as the first god and other gods like Poseidon and Hera, and so on as secondary gods over different levels of reality. Although apparently Plethon only intended this work for a small audience or as a private work, unlike his published works, which do not feature this kind of open endorsement of paganism, other aspects of Plethon's work merited suspicion by Scholarios and his other critics. Parenthetically speaking, as to whether Plethon himself was a dedicated crypto-pagan or open pagan himself remains a matter of disputes in the literature. But for the case of Scholarios, it was Plethon's critique of Aristotle and his advocating Plato that sounded the anti-Christian alarm. The controversy over Scholarios' engagement with Plethon after he wrote his treatise, titled the De Differentis, or on the full title, On the Departure of Aristotle from Plato, as a critique of Aristotle in defense of Plato. Although the majority of the work is a philosophical defense and could be read as a philosophical text outside Christian considerations, Plethon indirectly appeals to a Christian monotheist framework as a support for his attack on Aristotle. For instance, in affirming a plurality of unmoved movers, which one sees in Aristotle's Metaphysics 12, chapter 8, Aristotle appears to affirm a plurality of gods without affirming one primal god over the others. Aristotle's god or gods, in turn, are only responsible for the motion of the universe and not for its very being, in Greek, either the Ani or the Ousia beings. As for a Christian creationist, Aristotle affirms to affirm the forms as the models by which the different kinds of beings come to be, which would concord with the Christian view of God creating on the basis of divine ideas, and so on, sort of a package of different issues. An example of this kind of critique we can see in our first passage, when Plethon accuses Aristotle of atheism, connecting his use of the divine with Anaxagoras, who makes mind, in his words, preside over all things, but went on to pursue his argument without reference to mind, much the same way that Aristotle references the gods as presiding over our universe, yet makes no use of them. Oblique as the reference may be here, Plethon is partly referring to Aristotle's unmoved movers as being only responsible for beings' motion. For Plethon, however, following his analogy of artifice makers, the divine has to be directly involved with the ordering as well as the production of beings, which for Aristotle is not necessary. One can see this kind of anti-Aristotelian critique in earlier Neoplatonists, such as Proclus and earlier Middle Platonists, and Plethon's argument seems little different in this respect. Instead, for Plethon's Plato, God is equated with the Neoplatonic one, which is above being, and is responsible for producing the intelligible realm, populated by intellects identified with the forms, while they in turn produce matter and the sensible worlds. In this respect, Plethon adapts a two-creation model, although in reverse order from early Christians like Augustine and Origen, who posited that God created matter first before creating the sensible worlds. Plethon's defense of Plato against Aristotle roughly follows the scheme, showing how Aristotle deviated from Plato's original model. Given this broad structure of Plethon's treatise, and generally in his response to Scholarius' own critique of Plethon, it is notable how Plethon makes no reference to revelation or divinely inspired sources, which one can see in the second passage on the slide from the introduction of his treatise. Effectively, the sole basis of Plethon advocating for Plato is the philosophical strengths or weaknesses of Plato's framework in contrast to Aristotle. Although for certain scholars this is evidence of Plethon's crypto-paganism, Plethon's methodology may rather be hearkening back to what we saw in Barlaam. Effectively, the truth of Christian revelation is equal to the truth of pagan philosophical wisdom. In other words, for Plethon, Plato is right, and Christian revelation happens also to be right, since both pertain to and correctly describe the same reality. What is striking with Plethon is, unlike Barlaam, his argument is almost entirely on philosophical grounds. It is this point that Scholarios highlights in his response treatise to Plethon, in Plethon's text, the De Differentiis. Scholarios takes Plethon's criticism seriously and ends up critiquing Plethon's defense of Plato by arguing that it is rather Aristotle, rather who is the better philosopher. One sees a striking example of this in the first passage, when Scholarios critiques Plato and his followers for not aiming at the inward truth and implicitly using metaphors and imaginative language to philosophize, rather than, as Aristotle and the Peripatetics do, aiming to discuss external manifest things in a clear way, in his words, free from all obscurity and doubts for the benefit of humanity. Although one could make the critique, and probably fair critique too, that this is a shallow objection against Plato, and is besides the point, Scholarius' appeal to the language of clarity as free from all obscurity and doubt harkens back to similar language in Nicholas Methone, referring to knowledge obtained through revelation as also clear and simple, in contrast to the variegated language of pagan wisdom, as in Proclus with Nicholas. Scholarius' critique of Plato, although much more philosophical than rhetorical in this sense, and one sees more objective philosophical objections later in this treatise. So although more philosophical in this sense, it presents some loose but possible parallels in this framing. Scholarius, for his part, takes his inspiration from Thomas Aquinas and other Latin scholastics, much of which he translated himself, building off of earlier Latin to Greek translation movements decades beforehand, such as the Caedonese brothers and so on. Scholarius finds himself persuaded by the scholastic method, and in turn, Aquinas and the other scholastics' preference for Aristotle as in concord with Christian truth. This much is apparent in our second passage on the slide, early on in his reply to Plethon, that his interest in Aristotle is not simply for philosophical reasons, but rather as an appeal to Christian revealed truth. As he mentions elsewhere, neither Plato nor Aristotle attained the full truth manifested in divine revelation. Yet insofar as Aristotle approximates more closely with Christian positions, for Scholarius, Aristotle is to be defended against other positions that philosophically endanger Christian position. Hence, this means that Plethon's defense of Plato is an attack on a Christian framework. What is striking in Scholarius' presentation, especially if we compare with our earlier authors in the previous pairs 1 to 3, is that he explicitly endorses the philosophical authority as directly belonging to a Christian position, even if Aristotle does not have the full revelation of the Christian Trinity, for instance. The closest Scholarius comes to the previous Byzantines we have considered is perhaps Psellos, who holds up Proclus as the highest and best representative of philosophy outside Christian revelation. However, unlike Scholarius, Psellos still holds Proclus at a distance. Strikingly, he keeps a strong distinction between Proclus and Christian philosophy, in his words, even if Proclus comes close at different points. By contrast, Scholarius appears to make Aristotle an essential part of the Christian philosophical projects. Perhaps this may just be a difference in degree between Psellos and Scholarius, and yet it is still striking how we find an explicit endorsement of a philosophical authority for the Christian view in Scholarius that is not found in the same way in Psellos, much less any of the other authors we have looked at. In turn, comparing Scholarius and Plethon, Scholarius clearly follows the pattern of orthodox pro-ecclesial authors like Nicholas and Palamas and subordinate pagan philosophy to revelation. As in these cases, this becomes the explicit criterion for deciding on Aristotle as a philosophical authority. By contrast, for Plethon, it's almost entirely seems to be the inverse. It is rather reason that becomes the explicit criterion, not revelation, for deciding on Plato as the authority, and only this because the Christian framework in turn follows the insights of reason and philosophical activity. Plethon's method, in this sense, comes close to Barlaam, although, as we have mentioned, even the appeal to Christian revelation as a distinct, if nominally privileged, source of knowledge appears to be dropped. Such an equality of reason and revelation here would harken back to late Neoplatonists like Olympiodorus and Proclus, who see different revelatory sources as all approximating, together with Plato and other valid philosophical schools, one reality in their own respective ways. So, Now that we've gone through our four pairs of authors, between what I've generally termed the harmonists of reason and revelation and the anti-harmonists, or at least those who heavily qualify a harmonist reading of reason and revelation, I think we can see now that there is some interesting correlation and repetition of these pairs across different periods and controversies. And we can note some interesting observations in the development and evolution of the pro and anti-harmonist positions. In particular, with the possible exception of Gregory Nazianzen, at least from the context of Oration 28, almost all of Camp B wouldn't disagree with the idea that a philosophical authority can be chosen. However, who or what kind of authorities judge the merit of how close they are to revealed truths, like Aristotle for Scholarios, or simply divinely inspired figures like Dionysius for Nicholas and Methone? Although Palamas does not name specifically favored authors, Palamas doesn't name specifically favored authors, his framework allows for the selection of authority from reason, however, only if done correctly, and finally, only with revelation as a certain guide. Of course, we can see some crossover from the other column here, namely Psellos and Clement, who come close to Palamas' position, although perhaps tonally they are more optimistic about reason in relation to revelation, unlike Palamas. It is perhaps Barlaam and Plethon who are the most striking in the harmonist column in Camp A. They go further than Psellos and Clement in asserting the equality of truths discerned by reason with revealed truths. While this goes beyond the scope of my talk, it seems clear, at least to me, that Barlaam and Plethon see themselves as Christians assenting to revelation, yet they see revelation as, in turn, illumined by truths found in pagan learning, in a way hinted by Psellos' own approach, although Psellos brackets revelation as the final criterion in a way that Barlaam and Plethon do not. Many further comments could be made, but bearing time in mind, seeing that we are about 45 minutes in, for now I'll leave this aside and present our figures as the start of a broader study on the question of epistemic authority throughout the Byzantine tradition, where all authors grapple with the certainty and authority of Christian revelation as an orienting guide in one form or another. I appreciate and thanks for your listening and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. Any questions? Thank you very much. I don't know how. Daniel is over there. Maybe. Did you, Daniel, raise a hand? Maybe?
No, it was just a clapping emoji.
Oh, okay. That's okay. Anybody? Okay.
I would like to pose the question, if I can. Can I? Can you hear me?
Yes, sure.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And thank you for your talk. I was really happy to hear about this because I barely know anything about the continuity of Byzantine tradition. And so this may be a kind of uninformed question, but I was wondering, was there any author really ready to bite the bullet and to claim that there is something wrong with revelation? Maybe not revelation per se, but maybe with the sources of revelation. Let's say, I don't know, maybe like kind of Averroistic position in Byzantine. So maybe we need a reinterpretation of the sources of revealed truths, even though revealed truths are obviously infallible. Something like that. I don't know, maybe Gemistos is the closest to that position.
Yeah.
You could elaborate.
Yeah, I think even without, even if you don't take the second scholarly positions, the secondary scholarly position, some people who want to say that Plethon really is just like he has his own Parthenon like temple in his house or something like that. Even if you say that he's a Christian, I think he comes very close to the Averroist sort of position in a way. But what's at least in this, if you bracket the Book of Laws where you see him like establish clearly the Greek Parthenon, the different gods as responsible as causes. I think you see him really see that pretty much you have to rely on pagan philosophy, or basically like reasoning and looking at the full panoply of different philosophers as providing like the main criterion for assessing truths. It's, at least from what I understand of Plethon, I have to look more, but I don't think he really engages with Christian like revelatory sources strongly, just tacitly. But elsewhere he sees, like, he'll draw on different he says that he draws on the Zoroastrians, which he really means the Chaldean oracles and other pagan sources, and sees them all together as a kind of part of a perennial religion or truth. Supposedly he was known for saying that he thought that after the Council of Florence in the 15th century, there would just be one religion transcending the differences between Greek Orthodox, Latin Catholic, and so on. Although the source is a little bit, he was the one of the critics of Plethon, so how much to take that is a little bit iffy, but you see something like that in his work. The way I would read Plethon is the way I would read like Olympiodorus as a pagan, the way he looks at Christian truths. He also thinks that Christians are basically at the same path. They're on the right path, like pagans, like, but they just see the different gods as just divine attributes, but they're describing one and the same thing. That in that sense, it comes close to Averroes. But where I would see the difference, though, is Averroes, I think, though, he would still say that religion really is just at the level of imagination. It's not even getting you the full truth that you have in the intelligible. I don't know if Plethon is going that far, but I mean, he really does put an emphasis on reason and reasoning as basically the ground for assessing truths and as your kind of authority. If that answers your question.
Yes, thank you very much.
I think Jane raised her hand, so Jane is next.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm completely new to most of this, so thank you very much. This was fascinating. And forgive me if this is a very kind of ignorant question or ignorant of the sort of form and genre of the writing, but does Gregory Palamas anywhere refer to sort of specific, say, historical examples of the kinds of knowledge that he describes as the gift from God, given directly to the intellect? Either examples of, revelation that he finds particularly, I don't know, theologically sound, or even examples from his own life where he feels he was perhaps given a gift of intellection about the spiritual by God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I need to do more work on Palamas, but here and there, I think he makes reference to individual. I think he does make reference to certain individuals. I think that he was personally acquainted with in the Hesychist movement, and then he'll make, of course, reference to different saints, of course, who have like the vision of gods, for example, and that becomes more apparent in the later controversy. In later writings. The earlier writings, I like, at least with this, I mostly just focus on the early writings before he gets the articulated defense of the ousia, energei, essence, energies, or activities distinction. At this stage, he's more interested in, interestingly, Aristotle. Like, I didn't include the passages, but he basically thinks Aristotle is right in terms of logical demonstration and arguments. But that's the derivative that pertains to the derivative gift of God part. I guess you're more interested in the revelatory sources. But yeah, I think he does mention specific authors or specific people who have, like, they basically get a vision of God, and he tries to make a defense of, like, saying that, well, there is something, they actually have an unmediated direct access to God that is a preview of the afterlife. It's not just a created intermediary. I think in this, he's really kind of pushing back against, one thing I think he's pushing back against is really Proclus, or like the kind of pagan Proclean kind of approach where you have to have intermediaries between the gods or the one and human participants for that kind of divine union. And that there are other elements going on there. That's hopefully kind of an answer to your question.
Thank you. Any more questions? I'll have one or two questions. If there is anybody, if there is nobody else, okay. One is again very light question, and that's did you find anything similar to proofs of God's existence in any of these writers, similar to what Thomas Aquinas did. Just out of curiosity, did you find anything similar to that?
Mm-hmm. You find like loose fragments of of arguments. This kind of shows up in Palamas's 150 chapters. It's a summary of, it probably elaborates in other writings, but you'll see some kind of version of like the Aristotelian first mover argument. You see that kind of recapitulated. Scholarios, I have to look, but I'm sure he probably knows the 5 ways from the Summa of Thomas. But it's, my guess is he probably approximates that kind of arguments too. But I mostly have just been reviewing secondary sources, at least with Scholarios, but I haven't really seen anything discussed on that specifically, but it does come out here and there, mostly fragmentary, I would say. Because it's a good question otherwise.
No, I was just curious. And the other thing is, you distinguish between knowledge that we gain via reason, or we rely on reason to get it, or and knowledge via revelation. And that's kind of standard division. But what I was wondering, whether you noticed any specific understanding of the reason in these authors. When you look at Aristotle, and when you look at intellectual virtues, and if you look at the division of the soul, there are 3 parts of the soul, and the reason itself is divided, and then you have practical reason, but then you have theoretical reason, and then again capacities of the reason are different there. You have demonstrative, and then meaning the standard logical derivations, and then you have something that we would call intuition, but it's kind of immediate knowledge. It's not irrational. It's immediate knowledge, like direct. So I was thinking, how whether this kind of fine distinctions for those who are not Aristotelians directly exists there, whether they are making these fine distinctions, and then how is, for example, this immediate knowledge or immediate grasp of something, does that have to do something with the revelation as well? Like, is it playing part right there? It's a vague, but I was thinking, when you were dividing all these positions, and the reason comes up on the one side all the time, but I'm thinking whether they have slightly different understandings of reason or something like that.
Yeah, definitely. So Palamas, for example, in this defense, or his argument for demonstrative knowledge, so he's basically saying that those first premises in syllogisms, so it'll appeal to Aristotle directly for those. Those first premises have to be, basically he thinks you can get those first premises either through basically the virtue faith. And he thinks that actually the knowledge imprinted in the soul but in this case just by faith, that is already meeting this requirement for self-evidence immediate premises that you have in the posterior analytics Aristotle. But he also will appeal to the hesychast direct participation in God, and that already is self-evident both through the senses but also intelligible. So there's that second way. It's explicit with Aristotle, with Palamas using the Aristotelian distinction, and I mean that would be basically through nous. Faculty for direct apprehension of principles. So that would be a straightforward thing with the hesychast, for instance, who has this direct participation in God, the sensible aspect of that. Faith, I think he also thinks, is something that is. I need to look if he connects the knowledge that one gets through faith is also with nous, but it's something I think probably connected. So there you have that. So that's one example. I'm sure it also shows up in Scholarios. I haven't looked at that far at him yet. I think if you look at whether the Aristotelian distinction shows up earlier with Psellos, that's also another one I have to look at in detail. So when you see these arguments, they're mostly put in pretty general terms, usually with reference to non-Christian authors, but they will connect that with also just pure reasoning, and reasoning in this sense too, with things that are grasped either through nous or through the senses. They'll say, well, just those by itself, that's not enough. You have to have either revelatory, like basically ascending to revelatory sources through faith. There's something else outside of just the normal process of intuition. That you can see connect with Aristotle, but it's not specified. Like Palamas is interesting because he does appeal directly to Aristotle for that kind of technicality. It's an initial answer to your question, which is a very important one.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I think Slobodan raised his hand over there. Slobodan,
yes. Thank you very much. This is very interesting. You kind of addressed what I wanted to ask in your last response. I mean, I had a sort of a peculiar question, basically. So this, if we see like when this rupture between the Christian picture of the world, if we want to call it that, and kind of a modern scientific picture appears, like around the scientific revolution. One of the reasons is that people simply realize that if you want to really know something reliably about the world, it's going to take forever, right? Like you have to find out about the micro details. The world is, maybe infinitely large, and so on and so on. So, very few people had faith at that point or conviction that they can actually. And on the other hand, if you really believe in revelation, that must be saying something very complicated about the world, right? That if you want to understand it by these kind of scientific means, it's basically an infinite process. You will never get there. So I'm wondering, like, this is all happening before the 17th century, when maybe the world didn't really look that complex. So that there are all these hidden layers that you can discover. Although, I mean, arguably, even Aristotle realized that it's pretty complex. So I'm wondering whether this issue actually sort of comes up at all across these various sort of views. I mean, I would understand skeptics maybe, but I don't know if they have reasons of that sort. That's all.
Yeah, at least with the scholastics, and this kind of comes in at the ends between Scholarios and Plethon. There's a lot of disputing about how much to follow Aristotle, and again, this goes with empirical sciences developing in the 16th, 17th century, and even before that. You're definitely right there, but this also shows up in these earlier disputes. Gregory is interesting. Gregory Nazianzen is also interesting in this sense because he'll make the same kind of arguments, but he'll use Plato's language about it's difficult to come across or to harpen upon the creator of the cosmos, but he'll say, like, he basically twists Plato's words in a way where actually the way that Plato went through it with the Timaeus, like even that was that doesn't really even give you a correct picture. Like just happening to get to like a correct understanding of the first principle or of the first cause. So, I mean, in that case, he's working more of just from metaphysics. It's a bit different than like the lower natural level, especially working with like when you're working with a knowledge of even a notion of knowledge, which is more essentialist in that sense. But even when you get to this later period with the empirical, both dealing with the empirical sciences and what can be known about individual objects on a particular level, I think that just expands this basic question of like, well, does one actually get the right essence of a thing in trying to get knowledge of it, or is one just left with kind of a collection of different properties about a thing? But like even approximating a model of what that essence would be, is that getting you closer or not? That's the pretty common strain, at least I feel like with Western scholastics, especially when you get to the 14th century on, that becomes a big issue. But this is also coming up too in the Byzantine context. And Not far behind Plethon, Scholarios, like 150 years earlier, you had Theodore Metochides, who basically thinks there can be no certain knowledge at any level except for mathematics and revelation. He'll also say that revelation in mathematics gives you certainty that anything else involving the senses otherwise does not. And for him, even metaphysics falls in that category because you're still starting with the senses, and he follows Aristotle there. Most intellection starts with the senses. So this also shows up in the Byzantine world. All this, by the way, is bracketing, of course, the difference between a Humean notion of causality versus pre-Humean, essentialist versus, that. But I think you see these aspects already in the background, also on the Byzantine side.
Yeah, thank you.
I just wanted to add to what Jonathan was saying. The world was seen as very layered, and there were hidden realities that we had to kind of discover, but not in a way that we think about them today. We think about hidden or causes that are to be discovered, and medieval, but at least in the West, I'm less familiar with the East. In the West, they thought of the meanings hidden in the things. So you have to kind of uncover the meaning that are there. Also, you had to discover hidden remedies that are, again, all over the nature that we can use for medicine. And because and all of that comes out of our fall. The fall obstructed our view and connection with nature, and nature was transparent before our fall to us, and we had direct connection to it. And now we are in this kind of foggy foreign world after the fall due to our primordial sin, and we have to struggle through it to find a way to help ourselves, help our fellow brothers, and so on and so forth. So the world was complex, and it hid all kinds of things that we now have to work hard to discover. So that, but again, it's not causes, hidden causes, or laws of nature. Laws of nature come later, but some either hidden meanings or essences, or as Jonathan said.
Definitely.
So
and this is especially dealing with people who will directly tie physical properties with like the essences in particular things. And there's a lot of skepticism about can you actually get a positive grasp of essences? But interestingly, I think this is on both Byzantine and Western scholastic sides too. You get the same issues. And maybe the skeptical thing is like it's more pronounced, in some ways, maybe more pronounced on the Byzantine side. But then when you get to 13th, 14th century on with the Latins, it also gets brought out too. You have again, Plethon's kind of the guy who kind of kicks off. I think you see really with Plethon the kind of the push back on the idea of I have to think about this also as I'm saying this, but I think Plethon is kind of like the guy responsible for bringing in the humanists and the Latin side through basically making Plato popular again, but in so doing also pushing back against this idea that trying to get the essences of things. He's more interested in let's just see what someone like Plato is saying by himself, regardless of this question of essences and the way that Aristotle uses it. There's a lot going on there, but yeah, it's definitely touching the right. Yeah, it's definitely following there.
Okay, so do we have any more questions, or are we all done for tonight? Okay, so thank you, Jonathan, very much for the great talk, and thank you all for the questions. And please stay tuned, because Jane Copper is giving next lecture on next Monday, and we'll keep you posted from our center here in Belgrade. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye-bye.